A drone just captured something in the fourth chamber of Jacob's Well that no human has seen in over 40 years. What its camera found down there confirmed the worst fears of every scientist watching the live feed. And what the sonar picked up beyond that, at the very edge of its range, is something nobody can explain yet. The water that fills Jacob's Well comes from deep underground. Spring-fed, 68 degrees year-round, so clear it looks like liquid glass. On any summer afternoon in the Texas Hill Country, just outside the small town of Wimberley, you will find dozens of people lined up along limestone ledges, hurling themselves into this perfectly circular opening in the bed of Cypress Creek, 12 feet across, turquoise, impossibly inviting. It is one of the most photographed swimming holes in the entire state of Texas, and every single person jumping into it is jumping into the mouth of a massive underwater cave system that has killed at least 12 people. Jacob's Well is not a well. It is a karst spring, the surface opening of a vertical cave that drops straight down through layers of limestone into the Trinity Aquifer, one of the most critical freshwater systems in the American Southwest. The rock that forms it was laid down nearly 100 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. The cave itself was carved over millions of years by slightly acidic groundwater dissolving limestone grain by grain, opening chambers and passages into a labyrinth that no human mind designed and no human hand controls. For swimmers, the experience ends at the bottom of the first chamber, a sunlit room roughly 30 feet deep. Beautiful, safe enough if you stay there. But for cave divers, that chamber is just the welcome mat. And what lies beneath it is why Jacob's Well has earned a reputation that no swimming hole should ever carry. It is known in the cave diving world as a diver's grave. The cave stacks at least 4 known chambers deeper into the earth, each one darker, tighter, and more lethal than the last, connected by narrow passages with names that sound like warnings because they are warnings. The squeeze between the second and third chambers is called the birth canal. Further down, features carry labels like the coffin and the final squeeze. These are not dramatic flourishes invented by storytellers. They are accurate physical descriptions of spaces that have ended human lives, and the mechanism that kills is devastatingly simple. The floors of the deep chambers are not solid rock. They are covered in a thick layer of powdery limestone silt accumulated over centuries. One misplaced fin kick transforms crystal clear water into a dense, opaque white cloud in less than a second. This is called a silt out. In that instant blindness, a diver becomes disoriented. They cannot see their gauges. They cannot find their dive buddy. They cannot locate the guideline back to the surface, if they ran one at all. Panic takes hold. A panicked diver burns through their air supply at a rate that turns minutes into seconds. They get lost. They run out of air, and the well claims another victim. At least 12 people have disappeared into these passages. Many of the bodies are wedged in locations so deep or so structurally unstable that recovery has been deemed impossible. The well becomes their permanent tomb. And despite this history, despite every warning, divers kept coming. They wanted to go deeper. They wanted to see the fourth chamber. The cycle of tragedy became so severe that local authorities eventually welded a heavy metal grate of thick rebar directly over the entrance to the deeper chambers. They believed this would close the story. It did not. Divers began arriving after dark with bolt cutters. The grate was cut open again and again. The well refused to stay closed. That is when science stepped in, not to send another human into the darkness, but to send something that did not need to breathe. On a calm morning, a team of researchers and geologists gathered at the edge of Jacob's Well. A white van sat parked on the limestone bank, its side doors open to reveal a bank of high-definition monitors. The machine they were deploying was a small, bright yellow, remotely operated vehicle called Explorer, industrial grade, built to withstand crushing pressure. Equipped with multiple 4K cameras, powerful forward-facing lights, and advanced sonar capable of mapping cave walls in total darkness with centimeter-level precision, a thick fiber-optic tether connected it back to the van, delivering live video in real time. The mission was straightforward: descend to the fourth chamber, build the first complete 3-dimensional map of the system. A technician lowered the Explorer into the mouth of the well. On the monitors, the screen filled with blue. The first chamber was stunning. Texas sunlight caught the rock walls, illuminating the room in pale gold and turquoise, colors that had no business existing inside a cave. The operator tilted the drone forward and guided it down an angled slope into the second chamber. The screen shifted from bright blue to deep indigo. At 80 feet, the sunlight was gone. The drone's lights engaged, cutting white cones through absolute subterranean blackness. Smooth, pale limestone walls carved by millennia of moving water stretched in every direction. Then came the birth canal, barely wide enough for the ROV, a floor of deep, loose gravel. The operator cut the thrusters to minimum power, threading the machine through with millimeter precision, avoiding the silt. A few minutes later, the drone emerged into the third chamber, a wider, darker void. Silent, still, systems checked, everything stable. The operator pointed the drone toward a narrow crack at the far end of the chamber. The entrance to the fourth, the drone pushed into the tunnel. The walls closed in immediately. The passage was tight. The floor was a shifting, unstable bed of rock and silt. This was a place no human had seen in decades. Then the drone's lights caught something, a reflection off something that was not rock. The operator stopped. He zoomed in. On the monitor, unmistakable, a scuba fin sticking upright from a pile of gravel. The van went completely silent. The operator panned slowly. A few feet away, a corroded oxygen tank half buried in silt, its regulator encrusted with decades of mineral deposit. Then a tattered strip of black wetsuit snagged on a rock projection. And then they saw it, tucked into a crevice, partially pinned beneath gravel that had shifted over years and decades, were the skeletal remains of a human being. The scientists went still. This was no longer a geological survey. It had become a recovery mission performed by a robot. On the remains of the wetsuit, a small, faded name tag was barely visible. With digital enhancement, the letters came slowly into focus. The name read Kent Mopin. That name hit the team like a physical impact. Kent Mopin was not just another lost diver. His disappearance on September 9, 1979, was one of the most documented and haunting incidents in the well's history, generating newspaper coverage, a massive rescue operation, and a community trauma that the town of Wimberley had carried for more than 40 years. Now a robot was providing the answer, decades after every human effort had failed. The footage revealed the mechanism with terrible clarity. The passage was extraordinarily narrow. The floor was unstable gravel that could flow and cascade like slow-motion liquid when disturbed. Kent had not simply gotten stuck. The cave had buried him. But the drone was not finished. As the camera panned further, the lights found another set of scuba tanks, another fin, another body. Kent Mopin had not been alone when he died. The van absorbed the realization in silence. The drone was hovering inside a mass grave. To understand what that drone found, you have to understand what happened on September 9, 1979. Cave diving in that era was the wild west of extreme exploration. No widely enforced safety standards, no mandatory guidelines. No institutional authority capable of stopping an experienced open-water diver from deciding on a warm Texas evening that he was going to push into an underwater cave passage with nothing but a tank of air and his own confidence. It was a frontier culture built on bravery, ambition, and the specific thrill of going somewhere no one else had been. Jacob's Well was one of their most coveted prizes. The fourth chamber, largely unmapped, rarely reached, occupied a mythological status, the last frontier of the system, the room that separated the serious from everyone else. Kent Mopin was built for that world, experienced, fearless, obsessed with the well after multiple dives that had taken him progressively deeper without satisfying the compulsion to see what was further down. His companion that evening was Mark Brashear, a student at San Antonio College. Eager, adventurous, deeply impressed by the more seasoned Kent, they were part of a group of 8 divers who had driven out to Wimberley and set up camp near the well. The kind of trip that starts with excitement and the nervous energy of people about to do something that genuinely frightens them. As darkness settled over the hill country, Kent and Mark suited up. Another diver named Joe entered the water with them and followed through the first chamber, down into the second, and watched them squeeze through the birth canal into the third. Then the plan changed in a way Joe had not been told to expect. At the far end of the third chamber, Kent and Mark stopped at the dark crack in the rock and began removing their steel tanks from their backs, pushing them ahead into the passage. Standard technique for navigating tight spaces. Also a technique that commits you fully before you can assess what is inside. Nobody had told Joe this was the plan. He swung his light frantically. Mark never looked back. He just kept pushing himself into the hole. Joe stayed at the entrance and banged his dive knife against his tank. Sharp ringing signals through the water. Silence answered him. His own gauge was running low. He held his light aimed into the tunnel as long as survival allowed, a desperate beacon, and then turned for the surface. As he ascended, the crystal clear water turned white. a full silt out, expanding upward through the cave. Something deep inside had disturbed the gravel, either the two divers moving through it, or, as the drone footage would later confirm, the unstable floor cascading under their weight. Joe broke the surface alone. He looked around at the quiet Texas night. He screamed for help. He already knew the well had taken them. The police officer who responded that night called Don Dibble, owner of a local dive shop in San Antonio, former Navy diver, widely regarded as the finest deep-water rescue specialist in the state of Texas. Dibble had responded to diving emergencies before. He knew what a late-night call from Jacob's Well meant in terms of survival probability, but he came anyway. He arrived immediately with his partner Paul Battaglia and a team of trained volunteer rescue divers. When they reached the well, the other divers from the group were gathered on the limestone bank, shaken and hollowed out by what they had watched happen. One of them reported that he had briefly attempted to enter the passage and believed he had seen something, shapes that might have been bodies, already partially covered by fresh gravel inside the cave. Don Dibble walked to the edge and looked at the dark opening in the water. He made the hard call. Too dark, too silty, too dangerous to send anyone in until daylight. The next morning arrived heavy with grim purpose. The first divers descended with small garden trowels, the tool of choice for delicate underwater excavation in unstable environments. They reached the entrance to the fourth chamber and found exactly what the drone would document 46 years later, a wall of loose, shifting gravel filling the passage like sand in an hourglass. They began moving it one careful handful at a time. For every rock they removed, more slid down from above to fill the space. The pile was in permanent slow-motion collapse. Moving it made it worse. It was like trying to dig a hole in dry sand, underwater, in total darkness, while breathing compressed air at a depth where every mistake accelerates toward catastrophe. The reports coming back from the divers produced in Don Dibble the decision that defines certain kinds of leaders. He announced he was going in himself. He was not going to ask his team to go somewhere he would not go. He geared up with methodical calm, took a game warden named Calvin Turner as his safety diver, and staged spare air tanks at 25 feet and 75 feet. He ran his safety line from the surface down into the cave. At the entrance to the fatal passage, he checked his pressure gauge, 100 psi. He calculated it against his depth, his workload, the temperature of the water. He had approximately 10 minutes. He gave the OK signal to Calvin, who held position at the entrance, and pushed his head and shoulders into the opening. The entire gravel pile collapsed. A cascade of rock and silt poured down in an instant and buried him to his arms. The water went from clear to zero visibility before he could process what had happened. He was pinned in absolute darkness, unable to move his arms, unable to bang his tank for help, unable to signal the diver 3 feet behind him that he was in trouble. His breathing rate spiked involuntarily. The compressed air that had promised him 10 minutes began draining at a rate he could feel but not control. He felt consciousness beginning to pull back from the edges. In that moment, Don Dibble made the kind of decision that only becomes possible when every other option has been removed. He accepted that he was going to die in Jacob's Well, alongside the men he had come to find. He decided that rather than spend his final air in panic, he would accelerate the process. He opened his mouth and began swallowing the silty water. Then his body acted without his permission. A violent, involuntary convulsion, the deepest survival reflex the human nervous system possesses, shook his entire frame. It shifted him just enough. Through the opaque cloud of disturbed silt, a light appeared. Calvin Turner had recognized the silt cloud for what it meant and moved in without hesitation, extending a spare regulator into the darkness. Don's hand found it. He pushed it into his mouth and drew the first breath of a man who had just come back from somewhere most people never return from. But the story was not finished with him. In the struggle, Don had swallowed significant quantities of air along with the water. As he and Calvin ascended toward the surface, the water pressure decreasing with every foot they rose, that air began to expand inside his stomach, the way gas expands in any pressurized container when the pressure is released. He could not expel it. The pain built to a level he would later describe as beyond language. He chose speed over safety and clawed his way to the surface. When he emerged from Jacob's Well, his stomach was distended beyond recognition. He removed the regulator from his mouth and screamed. The pain lasted 12 hours. At Brooke Army Medical Center, physicians treated him for decompression sickness. The recompression chamber did not help. X-rays revealed the truth. His stomach wall had ruptured internally from the expanding gas pressure. The resulting peritonitis, a massive infection of the abdominal cavity, was a condition that killed most patients before modern surgical intervention. The surgeon who operated described cutting into him as like slicing into a fully inflated basketball. It was a 1 in a million injury produced by a sequence of events that had never been documented before in diving medicine. The fact that Don Dibble survived is, by any reasonable assessment, a miracle. While he fought for his life in a San Antonio hospital, the recovery operation continued at the well. Another expert diver confirmed what everyone was now reporting. The gravel was impassable. The only path to recovering Kent and Mark required removing the entire gravel bed from the top down, working through 60 feet of water with industrial equipment. A commercial diving company was contracted. They brought in an industrial suction hose and began the extraordinary work of vacuuming tons of gravel from depth, depositing it into Cypress Creek. Days of labor. For every foot they cleared, the unstable walls contributed more. The well was actively refilling the space they created. The funding ran out before the passage did. A final assessment team arrived and delivered the same verdict every expert had reached. The risk was categorically unacceptable. The well was a moving, self-sealing grave. 12 days after Kent Mopin and Mark Brashear disappeared, the official search was ended. They were left where they were. The well was sealed with a concrete lid and a permanent grate. The fatal gravel bed had defeated every human effort to recover what it held. And then, 46 years later, a small yellow robot did what no human ever could. It hovered in front of those remains and recorded them in high definition for the first time in history. But the drone's mission produced more than a resolution to a decades-old tragedy. The limestone that forms the Texas Hill Country is some of the oldest surface rock in the state. The Edwards Plateau, of which this region is a part, contains hundreds of caves, springs, and karst features, windows into an underground world that covers thousands of square miles and connects in ways that are still being mapped. Jacob's Well sits at one of the most significant nodes in that system. It is not simply a cave, it is a living portal into the Trinity Aquifer, one of the primary water sources for millions of people across central Texas. The well's flow rate has been used for over a century as an indicator of the aquifer's health. When the well runs dry, as it has during severe droughts, most recently in 2009, it is a warning sign that registers across the entire regional water management system. For over 100 years, locals have described the well as bottomless. The drone appeared to disprove this by mapping the known chambers, but the known chambers are only what has been accessed. The system is a honeycomb of dissolved limestone passages extending in multiple directions from the main vertical shaft. Divers who have reached the fourth chamber and survived have reported feeling air movement through cracks in the rock walls. Movement that implies connections to spaces beyond anything that has been mapped. The drone's sonar captured readings that suggested additional voids behind the walls of the passages it traveled through. The fourth chamber may not be an endpoint at all. It may be a bottleneck, a filter between the accessible cave and a deeper system that has never been entered by anything with a pulse. Then there is what the indigenous people of this region understood about this place long before European settlers arrived and named it after a man called Jacob. The Tonkawa and other Texas tribes regarded springs as sacred places, locations where the boundary between the surface world and the world below was permeable, where the earth breathed. Jacob's Well, as one of the most powerful springs in the region, would have occupied a significant place in that understanding. The oral traditions that carried those beliefs were largely destroyed during the violent disruption of indigenous culture in the 19th century. But the sense of the place as something more than geology persisted. People who have spent time at Jacob's Well, even people with no particular interest in the supernatural, often describe something they struggle to put into words. A quality of attention the place seems to direct toward you, a feeling of being watched from below. Divers who have survived close calls in the cave system describe a phenomenon that is reported consistently enough that it cannot be dismissed. A pull, not the current of moving water, but something more psychological, more directional. A compulsion to go just a little deeper, to see what is around the next turn, to push past the exact point where rational assessment says stop. Whether this represents a genuine environmental phenomenon, some combination of nitrogen narcosis, oxygen deprivation, carbon dioxide buildup, or infrasound generated by the aquifer's movement through narrow passages, or something else entirely, the experience is consistent across decades of independent accounts. And then there is the aquifer itself. The Trinity Aquifer is an ancient, largely unexplored underground system covering enormous portions of Texas. What has adapted over geological time to its total darkness, its constant temperature, its unique chemistry is not fully known. Cave-adapted species exist throughout karst systems worldwide, including in Texas. The Texas blind salamander, found only in the Edwards Aquifer to the west, evolved in total darkness over millions of years. What equivalent adaptations might have occurred over the same time scale in the Trinity system in passages that no researcher has yet reached is a legitimate scientific question. The answer is not known, and the absence of knowledge is not the same as the absence of possibility. Jacob's Well is a natural wonder, a hydrological marvel, a direct and irreplaceable window into one of the most critical water systems in the American Southwest. It is also a tomb that holds at least 12 people and refuses to surrender them. And when the drone footage was reviewed in full, frame by frame, in the quiet of a research lab in the days that followed the mission, the scientists noted something they had not discussed publicly. At the very edge of the drone's sonar range, beyond the fourth chamber, the readings suggested the passage continued. How far, the sonar could not determine. The signal dissolved into static before an answer could be formed. The well goes deeper than the map. Whatever Jacob's Well is holding beneath that dark, perfectly circular opening in the bed of Cypress Creek, geological, historical, ecological, or something science has not yet found language for, one thing is beyond argument. It has kept its secrets for a very long time, and it is not finished keeping them.